welcome all. So internet, here we have so we have information on plant health, animal environment,
What do we do? Increasing crop losses by insects. I've mentioned this. Insects already consume 5 to about 20% loss. Therefore, pesticides come in and reduce that yield, that loss. Regulation dictates what amount you use and at what level and at what times. Many times, we simply go beyond the amount needed. In fact, none of my colleagues has said a rate used at any one study, the actual rates used, acceptable rates that must be administered with an expected residue left and the composition of that residue to non-active ingredients that cannot destroy the environment or kill anybody. But many persons from a third world would wish to add double. Medicine they will follow, every one of us. But when it comes to the spray of a compound or a chemical someplace, they would say, add a little more, it will actually destroy and kill as much as possible. And then you have concentrations in some places. There's nothing totally wrong with the use of any pesticide, proven right to control certain pests. But there is something completely wrong when we don't train the persons using it in the country or elsewhere, the amounts, the times, durations, and in fact, I should say here right away, Prof. Huber, that I think in my own, all through literature studies and everything, glyphosate is not persistent in the environment. It decomposes fairly quickly. That is where we go back and plant crops on the same place that glyphosate has been sprayed, even within the shortest time period.
GE crops are grown around the world and consumed around the world, and they have a fantastic safety record. To suggest otherwise simply doesn't fit with what the science says. Very safe. In fact, in many cases, they're safer than conventionally bred crops because of some of the attributes. BT crops, for example, in maize have a far lower level of fungal contamination and therefore far lower levels of fungal toxins, which are a very real health threat, particularly in this part of the world. The misuse of pesticides is a global issue. There is no doubt that it occurs around the world. And the point made by the FAO spokesperson this morning is we have to do a better job of educating the farmers, the users of pesticides, so that these abuses and misuses of pesticides don't continue to occur. When used properly, most pesticides are very, very safe. As mentioned, some of the higher risk ones are hopefully being phased out to safer products. Fertilizer use, like pesticide use, has been misused in times. It needs to be used appropriately with consideration to runoff and spread beyond the field. It's really important that you use it in the best way to minimize that spread where you don't want it. But when used properly, synthetic fertilizers are exactly why we're feeding the world today. If we didn't have them, we simply could not feed today's population, let alone the billions that are coming in the future. It was interesting this morning to see they started out with discrediting the regulators, because it is the regulators who make sure that the science is safe. So if you can instill distrust in the regulators, then you can then ignore what the regulators have to say. And that was their plan this morning. Notice they were saying that the Australian, New Zealand regulators weren't doing their job correctly. The EPA in the United States was not doing their job correctly. But the funny thing is when you look at how these crops are regulated, they're actually regulated around the world the same way. They're all done by UN OECD standards. And so everybody has to test all these food crops the same way. And what you were told this morning about how it's being tested is not anywhere close to the realities of how foods are actually tested before they come to market. A significant portion of the world is still on the fence, if you will, on the use of GE crops. Unfortunately, the global population expansions that are coming in the next decades do not really give us an option to not utilize that technology. But it's not a panacea. What it is part of the solution. We need to use the best of every form of agriculture if we're going to feed the world more sustainably on the same or less land. It's a complex science, there's no doubt about it. And unfortunately, those who are not well versed in the science are often misled by emotive arguments as opposed to scientific arguments. This morning's talk sounded like they were scientific to the average person. They were not. That has a significant impact on how countries that are on the fence or considering using this technology, it puts a lot of pressure on governments when that fear that is generated with this misinformation becomes widespread.
I believe the U.S. is one of the highest, if not the highest, consumer of pesticides. And even when we talk about DDT, which is not used in the U.S. anymore, when it was used, a fifth of the world's DDT was used just in California. So there's been heavy pesticide use. I think the myth is in the U.S. that this pesticide use is necessary and increases crop yield that high. And I think there's also a myth that the U.S. in this case uses so many pesticides because we're, quote, feeding the world. And that's one of the reasons why I showed the graph of where all of our corn goes. So that's our number one crop that we're using lots of glyphosate and lots of atrazine. Less than 2% of that corn is eaten by people in the U.S. and less than 11% is actually exported as food. So most of it right now goes to ethanol. So really the pesticides are being used for economic and financial reasons, not necessarily for that purpose. So our agriculture in the U.S. is really for economic reasons, not for, quote, feeding the world. It's my understanding that, for example, in the U.S., 50% of all crops that are produced gets wasted and not fed to anybody. I don't think that the government agencies and certainly not the agribusinesses are completely honest about the benefits of their chemicals. And I think it's something we really have to be aware of here in Africa, especially when in the U.S., multi-billion dollars being lost in lawsuits by Monsanto and all the bans in Europe. I think Africa is the one place that they're going to turn to sell their products. And that's why I think we have to be really careful about how we proceed.